Lesson 3, Slavery in the Colonies. In the summer of 1619, a Dutch ship carrying cargo that included a group of Africans landed at Jamestown. The local colonists paid for these Africans and forced them to work. The Africans were not paid and received only food and shelter for their work. In some areas, a few of them were given their freedom after working for some time. Within a few years, however, new laws were passed in Virginia and Massachusetts that took away all rights from African servants. They could be bought and sold as property. The practice, known as slavery, had begun in the English colonies. So now we have the slave trade. In the growing colonies, workers were needed. At first, indentured servants met this need. However, as the need for workers in the colonies grew, European colonists began to think that enslaved Africans could fill the needs for workers. Many groups of people had been enslaved throughout history, usually as a result of war. This time, it was different. Africans were captured, taken against their will, without hope of freedom or return to their families in Africa. At first, enslaved people came mostly from the western part of Africa, called the Gold Coast. Other Africans captured them and marched them to the coast where European traders waited on ships. Europeans traded guns and other goods for the slaves. Once the Africans were sold, they had to make the long and horrific journey to the Americas, known as the Middle Passage. This trip took a few weeks or several months. The ships were overcrowded, with the captives wedged below decks and chained to platforms stacked on top of one another. Unable to stand up or turn over, many of the enslaved died in this position. Oluda Ekwano, a young enslaved boy, suffered along with dying slaves. Later in his life, he described what he felt from the dead at the time. And this is our little primary source. It says, "I envied them the freedom they enjoyed, and as often wished I could change my condition for theirs." So our first reading checkpoint wants us to underline the words in the text that explain why slavery grew in the colonies. So the key here is this word right here, why. So if we are looking back in our text, I'm going to go up to the beginning of the slave trade. We want something that is going to show why slavery grew. Well, from reading again, I can see that it's saying at first indentured servants met the need, so they had servants. But, however, as the need for workers in the colonies grew, European colonists began to think that enslaved Africans could fill the need. So the sentence that explains why slavery grew is right here. As the need for workers grew, they needed more bodies, they needed more people to do the job, so therefore slavery then increased. Okay, let's continue. Slavery in the northern colonies. Not all enslaved Africans ended up in the English colonies of North America. Some continued on to the West Indies. There, they were sold in auctions. An auction is a public sale in which the highest bidder makes the purchase. Once purchased, enslaved Africans became the property of the winning bidder. They had few basic rights. Now I want to stop here and think about this. Do you think that was fair? Do you think that it was right for them to do that, to treat people like you may treat games or something like this, that you would just go buy them and sell them wherever you want to? What do you guys think? Okay, every colony practiced slavery at some time during its history. In 1641, the Massachusetts Bay Colony was the first colony to pass a law that allowed slavery. Other colonies, such as Maryland, followed shortly after with their own laws. The southern colonies, however, had the highest number of enslaved Africans. By the 1680s, slavery had been fully established in the colonies. The type of work the enslaved Africans did varied. Some worked in shops, helping artisans with their work, or learning how to do skilled work themselves, while others worked at inns or in the homes of wealthy residents. In the northern colonies, some enslaved Africans worked on farms, helping farmers perform the daily chores. A farmer in the north might need only 1 or 2 slaves on his farm. Mostly, though, northern farmers did not grow crops that required large number of workers. For that reason, there were fewer enslaved farm workers in the northern colonies. A few African Americans in the northern colonies were free. Some were able to buy their freedom by saving money from working in the cities or selling produce they grew. Sometimes a slaveholder would make the choice to set a person free. One such slave was Phyllis Wheatley. Phyllis was kidnapped and placed aboard a slave ship bound for Boston when she was 7 or 8 years old. In Boston, she was purchased directly from the ship by a local tailor. She became the personal servant of Wheatley's wife and was treated as a member of the family. She was sold to a Boston family in 1761 at an auction. She learned to write and became a noted poet. Her owners finally set her free. Free African Americans often continued to live in the cities of the northern colonies. However, free African Americans had few rights and could be kidnapped and taken back into slavery at any time. So, how was slavery different in the southern colonies compared to the northern colonies? Slavery was very different in the southern colonies than in the northern colonies. In the southern colonies, farmers grew large crops such as tobacco or rice. Later, they grew cotton. These crops required many workers to tend, pick, and prepare the plants for shipping. Many southern farmers relied on enslaved Africans to complete these tasks. Planters with large farms might purchase hundreds of enslaved people. In parts of the southern colonies, there were many more enslaved Africans than there were settlers. So the top of our next page has kind of a picture that depicts this. It says enslaved workers tend to cotton fields on a plantation. So very hard work that they were in charge of doing. Okay. So enslaved Africans did more than work in the fields and large plantations. They brought special knowledge and skills from Africa. For example, some Africans had knowledge about growing rice. Because of this, rice became a key cash crop in the Carolinas. The success of rice had a bad result for many Africans, however. Rice plantations grew larger, and so their owners purchased many more enslaved Africans to work on them. The way enslaved Africans lived in the South was different from in the North. In the South, enslaved Africans on large plantations lived in slave quarters, shacks that were clustered together. In many cases, they formed families that were a source of happiness and joy. Families, however, could also be a source of worry and fear. A family member could be sold at any time. It was common for slaveholders to separate family members from one another, such as husbands from wives and children from parents. Although plantation life was hard on African American families, enslaved people developed their own unique and rich culture. On some plantations, people from different parts of Africa were together. Words, foods, and music with African origins blended with European languages and customs on the plantations. The result would have a long-lasting impact on American customs and music. So there was a picture on the side here that says that enslaved Africans played handmade banjos, such as this one, and that is an instrument that we still have around today. All right, so we have a chart here, and it is titled Enslaved Population, North and South. Again, we apologize for the copies because the color doesn't come out very clear, so I'm going to label which of the parts here are the North and which are the South so that you're able to answer the next question. So what we have here is our first ones in each category. I'm going to label with an N because those are the North, which means that our next ones are going to be labeled with an S for South. Now that you have a clear identification of which colonies were represented by which, so what ones then are the North, which represent the South, you are able to do our second reading check. It says compare and contrast slavery in the North and South between 1670 and 1760. So you notice right here, 1670, 1760. You basically need to tell us what happened between here and here. How did slavery change in each of the colonies? Make sure you are answering in complete sentences. There are multiple lines here. So you should be able to basically fill those up. Include numbers if you need to.